All right, end of the semester, biomechanics of endurance performance. I hope you've enjoyed the content that we've covered this semester. And I am going to pull together sort of the big picture of the course. I did something similar in the beginning of the semester. I'm going to do it again now, just a little differently. And uh, when I teach this course, or when I teach any course, I almost always start with this slide. And the purpose of presenting this slide is that I want to emphasize how important it is to understand all areas of kinesiology to understand endurance performance, or and to understand performance, any performance that we're talking about. In our class, we're focused on endurance performance. What's performance? Performance is how well we do something, and that performance is at the bottom of this model. And I've gone through this model before, and I have a video on it specifically. But the idea behind this model is to recognize that how well we do something is built upon a number of different building blocks. And a lot of people will start focusing in certain areas of understanding performance. So, for example, sports psychology, what you think about can influence ultimately performance. So, if I'm doing a free throw and I'm doing it in my backyard versus during halftime of a game where you've got 80,000 people watching you, my ability to generate the right signals to the right muscles to generate the right force, to generate the right displacement in time, to have the right movements, may not, my ability to do that may actually be interfered by what I'm thinking. So sports psychology becomes very important. Motor control or motor coordination, the same issue. You know, how do we coordinate all these degrees of freedom, all these different muscle fibers generating force, ultimately causing a displacement time period or some type of movement? Or exercise physiology, you know, how do we engage the metabolic pathways to ultimately generate ATP, which allows for the sliding filament theory of contraction to happen, to generate a force, and so forth. Nutrition, the chemical energy that we need in the body to be able to transform that chemical energy to mechanical energy, or biomechanics, understanding the forces, or motor learning. I do a task and now I do it again. I'm learning how to do something. And sports medicine, how do you prevent injury as well as rehabilitate injury? You need to know all these things. So the key with understanding performance is to understand all areas of kinesiology. And outside of kinesiology, there's other areas as well. What's interesting is when we start having classes in biomechanics or nutrition or exercise physiology, what each class is doing is starting at a different place of this model and zeroing in on that. For biomechanics of endurance performance, we've been focused in on the forces, displacement and time. So really we're focused on kinetics and kinematics as that relates ultimately to performance. But we've also worked ourselves up to understanding the muscles and different aspects of muscle contractions that ultimately yield a muscle force that ultimately causes a joint motion and what have you. If you're in exercise physiology, you're probably spending more time understanding metabolic pathways, or starting here at least, before going in other directions here. And if you're in a motor control class, you're trying to understand the central nervous system and how that operates to ultimately send the correct signals and coordinate muscles in different ways. So I want to really impress upon you the importance of understanding all different areas in kinesiology to understand performance. This class we've zeroed in on the forces, so we should know laws of motion, we should know how to do a kinetic analysis, we should know our kinematic parameters, linear and angular, position, velocity, and acceleration. And we should know the link between kinematics and kinetics. You know, in essence, F equals ma. So it really is important to fully understand endurance performance. We are scratching the surface by focusing on biomechanics. Now, the other class I teach related to endurance performance is physiology of endurance performance. And in that class, obviously, I'm focusing more on the physiological processes that ultimately yield a muscle force, that if that force is applied at the right time, at the right magnitude, and coordinated with other muscle forces, we have a displacement in time of whatever, a joint or a limb or what have you. That's a movement, and ultimately all those movements put together is performance. And so in physiology of endurance performance, I'm starting more up in this region and working my way down. In biomechanics of endurance performance, we're starting more in this area, making sure we're understanding the biomechanical tools and then ultimately how to use those tools to understand endurance performance. But don't lose sight, we need to know all these different areas to understand human performance. The other slide, so that's one slide I need to go over. The other slide is this slide. And you've heard me talk about this concept over and over again through several other lectures. We have chemical energy in our body, and that chemical energy is in glucose, it's in carbohydrates, it's in fats, it's a little bit in proteins, but mostly carbohydrates and fats. And what we're doing when we're looking at doing human performance or any movement, we're taking that chemical potential energy and transforming it ultimately to mechanical energy. Mechanical energy being the energy of movement is what I'm really zeroing in on. I am using a broad brush here to describe that. So really we're talking about forces that are being applied over some distance in the mechanical energy world. So we take whatever chemical energy is in us and we transform it to mechanical energy. Sometimes we transform it quickly, sometimes we don't need to transform it quickly. And we have different ways in our body to transform the chemical energy to mechanical energy. And those ways are our metabolic pathways. We have aerobic metabolic pathways where we use oxygen, and we have anaerobic metabolic pathways. In both of those pathways, anaerobic does not use oxygen, the aerobic does. Both of those pathways are responsible for taking chemical energy, transforming that chemical energy ultimately to ATP, and that's what you go over in your anatomy and physiology classes, your physiology classes, your exercise physiology classes. You go over that process and understand the chemical reactions that have to happen for ATP to be produced, adenosine triphosphate. And then adenosine triphosphate is then critical to allowing the sarcomere to generate a force. And that force ultimately is applied at the ends of the muscle, the tendons that are connecting to bones. And ultimately those forces will create movement. And so here we have aerobic and anaerobic pathways, and aero going from one type of energy to another type of energy. I've gone over this concept that this process is never 100% efficient. And whatever amount of chemical energy we have here, we probably are only getting about 25% of mechanical energy of movement. Right now in your metabolic pathways, you may go from you may talk about an efficiency of about 33% in terms of generating ATP, but you still need to take that ATP, generate a force. All those forces need to work together to cause movement. We're actually even downstepping that efficiency of transforming chemical energy to mechanical energy, and we're getting maybe 25%, which is actually pretty good, for the way machines work and what have you. Where's the other 75% energy go? Well, that goes off in terms of heat, most likely. So you're generating a lot of heat during exercise, all right? And which we know. I mean, we get warm, we sweat, we try to get rid of the heat sometimes, or sometimes we try to retain the heat based on the environment. But we have these different pathways that transform chemical energy to mechanical energy. How fast those pathways operate is encapsulated in the term power. Power is a concept that we've talked a lot in this class, and you should fully understand what power is. You should know the units for power are watts. You should know the equation for power, rate of work done, so FD over delta T. You should also know that power can be calculated by force times velocity. And we can also do power in the angular world and replace those terms with in the equations with angular terms. So power tells us how fast we're transforming chemical energy to mechanical energy. That's what it's telling us. Sometimes we want to do it really fast. If we're lifting a weight, that requires a fast metabolic pathway. That's the anaerobic system. Sometimes we want to sustain a transformation of chemical energy to mechanical energy over a long period of time. That's your aerobic metabolic pathway. So in exercise physiology, you probably talk about terms like aerobic power and anaerobic power. It's really important to understand that that power term in that class means the exact same thing as it means in this class. It's how fast we're transforming chemical energy to mechanical energy through the aerobic pathway or through the anaerobic pathway. All right, so now this top model really forms the basis of both classes that I teach, physiology of endurance performance and biomechanics of endurance performance. In physiology of endurance performance, let's see if I got this working. Okay, there it is. I focus on these areas. All right. We focus on chemical energy that's stored in the body, fats, carbohydrates, liver, in the blood. And we talk about the aerobic metabolic pathway, the anaerobic metabolic pathway, and this thermoregulation process. We don't talk so much about mechanical energy in that class. And then we talk about fuel sources, the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, the chemical energy. The fuel storage, we talk about where the fuel is stored. And we talk about application of this information in terms of endurance performance, in terms of what fuel to take in before an event, during an event, and after an event. And obviously there's more things, but this is really what the side of this model that we're focused on is taking the chemical energy and transforming it over to mechanical energy. And then we also spend quite a bit of time talking about different training concepts. How do we make this aerobic pathway operate better, faster, or a bigger capacity? How do we make the anaerobic pathway operate faster or with a bigger capacity? Well, that's where we start talking about training programs and frequency, intensity, time, mode. We talk about monitoring training, using heart rate, looking at power, that we have in terms of different instruments we can use, RPE, rating of perceived exertion, or even talking about lactate levels in the blood. And then we also talk a lot about thermoregulation, why we sweat, why we need to really pay attention to a hydration plan during an endurance event, and what type of clothing or other gear that we wear, hat, gloves, wetsuits, whatever it is, to either retain heat or to let heat release from the body. So 457, 657 is in this area. Biomechanics of endurance performance is in this area. And there is an overlap. And so the training area, or this aerobic and anaerobic area, there's a big overlap here with this class. And so we've talked about several of these things, not as much as I would do in physiology of endurance performance, because in physiology of endurance performance, we're really talking about how to train the aerobic power, how to train anaerobic power, how to make those faster, how to generate more power aerobically, how to generate more power anaerobically. But in 456, 656, we're more over in this area of this model. So we're talking about forces. And in particular, we're talking about two types of forces, propulsive forces and resistive forces. And what's important is we need to remember forces are vectors, and forces have magnitude and they have a direction. And we need to account for that. We've talked about that. And we haven't talked so much about coordination, but we have talked about coordination and the importance of being able to coordinate muscles to generate the right type of propulsive force. And a lot of times when we're learning a skill, we actually are very uncoordinated. And we may actually generate too much muscle force from both agonist and antagonist, and actually be less effective at ultimately generating a propulsive force, which will work back into that efficiency of mechanical energy. So if we have bad running form, or we don't swim very well, this ability to take chemical energy to mechanical energy, the efficiency is reduced even further. And so propulsive forces, what makes us swim faster, what makes us bike faster, what makes us run faster. We've spent time on that, doing kinetic analyses and identifying forces acting on the person or sometimes the bike rider system. And then we've talked a lot about resistance force, mostly drag forces, and mostly in cycling and swimming. A little bit in running we've touched on, but mostly we look at drag forces in cycling and swimming. And the reason is because drag force is really apparent in those two activities for two reasons. In cycling, the speed at which the fluid, air, is moving over the object is much faster because we can attain faster speeds on the bike than we can during running. In swimming, the drag force is really apparent, not because of speed, but because of the density of the fluid being moved through. Water is about 800 times more dense than air. And we know our equation for drag force, and you should understand that equation and be able to produce it. 1/2 rho CdA v squared. You should know what each parameter in that equation actually means. Rho is the density of the fluid. CD and A all combined represent how the shape of the object, the characteristics of the object, and the frontal area of the object being moved through the fluid that will increase or ultimately decrease our drag resistance force. And then V is the velocity of the fluid moving over the object. So you should know those elements very well for the final exam. We have talked about drag forces during running, and there's some good research on this, and it can be a real force, especially if you are running into a headwind. The other forces that we've talked about in terms of resistance include rolling resistance, which is really applied to cycling, as well as slope resistance. And I leave that as a resistance force, mostly because we need to work hard to go uphill. Going downhill is a little different. If you're going downhill, the slope force would actually be a propulsion force. But I still put it under a category of resistance force because I'm mostly interested in this process of taking chemical energy and transforming it to mechanical energy, getting uphill. Going downhill, you're coasting, you're trying to be as aerodynamic as possible, you're trying to reduce the drag resistance force as much as possible. So going uphill is what we've focused on, and we also applied slope force to running, or at least talked about it. And then finally, in this category of this model is movement, or we start talking about why we do certain drills, why we may want to change stride frequency, why we may want to swim a little different, maybe use paddles during swimming or fins during swimming. We talk about technique, and the technique is really underscored by coordination, being able to coordinate muscles correctly so that you are being very efficient at transforming that chemical energy to mechanical energy. And then equipment, how equipment comes into play with movement, the clothing that is worn, the bike that is ridden, the types of gears a bike has, all the lever arm of the bike, the crank. All these things come into play with ultimately understanding how well we're able to generate a propulsion force going forward, which ultimately represents the mechanical energy that's been transformed from chemical energy. Okay, when I get this little saying down here, we do always have to be aware of injury. Too much change, too fast, or too soon, or too fast will ultimately lead to an injury. You don't give the body enough time to recover, and ultimately you end up having some type of injury. In endurance world, the injuries are typically overuse or chronic injuries. But then we can also circle back and talk about the same model as applied to how to rehab someone from an injury. And from choosing the right gear, choosing the right movement techniques, all right, fueling strategies, what have you. Okay, so that is the semester. Really, the semester boils down to two big slides. This process of taking chemical energy to mechanical energy, we should understand that. And for biomechanics of endurance performance, we're more focused on the mechanical side of this model. And then really one more emphasis on the importance of understanding all different areas in kinesiology to understand human performance. Okay, I hope that's a helpful summary, and I hope you've enjoyed the class, and I hope to see you again. All right, thanks so much.